Hello. Okay. Hi, Michael. Hey, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
Not bad. How are you?
Well,
Hey,
thank you.
Hi.
I was thinking of you, Michael, with this session, actually, wondering whether or not um, your project might involve some empirical research, because thinking about the, um, the reasons why those provisions don't get litigated and trying to understand whether that's taking place at the practitioner level, the judge level, or whatever. I was wondering whether you're envisaging any empirical research for that project in terms of interviews.
I hadn't thought of it in that way, but it is something I will turn my mind to. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, because in terms hello Alicia.
Hi.
I'm already influenced by you. We haven't even done the session. I'm just talking to Michael Simons, who's doing a doctrinal project on a section of the corporations law that doesn't get used, and it's exactly like to the empirically oriented. It's like I've been meaning. I think there was one of the sessions you couldn't make it to, Michael. I wanted to ask you about what, to borrow the language that Sandhya was using, was going to be your archive, in the sense that, like, what kinds of materials were you going to draw upon to do that investigation? Because it occurred to me that interviews with practitioners or judges as to why things go the directions they do and why decisions are made the way they do could account for, there could be something in the tail that is never going to be evident on the face of published cases, for instance, or pleadings or something like that.
Yes, and I must say I've had experience of a proceeding in which an application under the section, not precisely relevant to what I'm doing, but under the section was run, and the judge more or less at the end of the day said, well, I'm not going to order the injunction, so do you really want to press on with this and make me give you any written reasons?
That's right. And yet, had you not actually been privy to that, you wouldn't have seen the manoeuvre that accounts for the lack of jurisprudence. That is so,
yes.
that the lack of jurisprudence in turn accounts for the lack of motivation for people to go along a particular path, because it doesn't even seem to occur to them. It's not out there. It's not happening. So there's actually really interesting. Anyway, we've sort of casually started today's session without doing it properly. Let's wait a couple more minutes. Welcome to Alicia. I'll do another intro when we have more of us here. But yeah, it's just, that's what occurred to me, Michael, a couple of times, and I was hoping that you'd pop back in soon. And then when I saw that this was the session on today, I'm like, maybe I can plant a seed about that. It's always hard to get judges to speak, of course, when they don't want to be on record for saying something that could influence the approach they take or whatever. But often
there are certainly retired judges out there.
Correct, exactly. Lawyers and retired judges, exactly.
Yeah.
Here we go. We have more people arriving by the moment. Ling, you look like you're in a comfy chair today. Normally you're sitting in some office. There's a window. We're all getting to know each other's home environments or office environments or wherever it is.
Yeah, I'm not at home at the moment. I'm having a staycation with a friend.
Yeah, you look like you're cruising. You look much happier. And Caitlin looks distinctively like she's at Melbourne Law School. Yes, we know those windows. We know that grey paint.
No one's in the meeting room so far.
Unmistakable grey paint. Okay. Let's see. How is everyone doing? I'm hoping that Pfizer and Rashmi can also join us, because John, on behalf of everyone, we are just all thinking of you guys so much, and I just hope you are remaining as insulated from this disaster as you possibly can be.
Thank you. Trying to just stay away from everything. It's not the best situation, but yeah, I'm fine for now, fortunately.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that Pfizer and Rashmi will join us as well, because I had an email with Pfizer and she said something to the effect of just not leaving the house. So it's just awful, horrific. So it's just glad you've been able to join us and get even just a little sense of the support from everybody that's coming at you from around the planet. It's the one of the great benefits of this Zoom technology that we never knew would become so important to us, is that you can all genuinely be in the real time and genuinely convey these sorts of things personally in a way that we mightn't have been able to. So I'm just going to wait another minute to see who else joins us, and then I think we'll kick off, because apart from the session, we've also got some announcements and things that we're going to do in the middle and at the end about other exciting activities among your community. So who else is coming in now? I really hope Rashmi and Pfizer can. Okay. Well, look, Alicia, might I just introduce you and let's get going? I'm just so grateful that Alicia Blacken is doing this session, because Alicia is a superstar in discrimination and employment law, particularly around age discrimination. But she's one of the few people in this law school who has put methodologies, empirical methodologies, front and centre in her skill set. And I know that I've been wanting to learn from you, Alicia, on these things for a long time. I want to know by the end of today, have I missed my calling? Was I meant to be an empirical researcher? And I've still got time to change, you see. Because every project I come up with, it always has an idea of interviewing someone in it, because I love talking to people and finding out what's going on. And so I've often been really sorry that my basic research training and law school experiences before that did not include any skills of this kind. And so when you're, officially already the full-time academic and you go and do a proposal and your proposal suggests skills that you don't have yet, it's somewhere between embarrassing and a travesty. But then you go looking for them and they're not easily found as to where can I do my training on interviews or something like that. So it's really fabulous that we're able to not have the same outcome for you guys at the beginning of your academic journeys, but also because you may not yet know how empirical approaches could inform the projects you have set out for yourself. Or you may be keen on it, but haven't thought about the different techniques that you might be doing. But either way, this session, have we run it before, Alicia, a couple of years ago?
No, I was scheduled to run this session last year, and it was just at the point where everything went to pot. So, so I had this presentation ready to go, and it's been shelved for a year. So good that I could just kind of pull it out and brush it off and, dust off the cobwebs.
Perfect, because that actually, this does make it every bit as exciting as I thought it was, which is that we haven't done something this thorough before. And we're also going to be following it up with Christine Parker speaking to us about like a particular project that has engaged a range of these. But Alicia is actually doing fundamentals with us. So this is incredibly valuable and hasn't been done before. So you're a very lucky cohort. And if I can just also welcome Minna, I've let the other upper year students know about this session because of what I just said. No one's done something this specific. So I wanted to bring in as many people as possible. So Alicia, we're in your hands. We'll have a break at around the 3-ish mark, just for 5-10 minutes to get a drink and so forth. But I'm very happy, and welcome to Rashmi, who's joined us as well from India. And we'll get moving as soon as you're ready and however you wish.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kristen. And I'm really delighted to be here with you all. The first thing that I would say is I can't do justice to every empirical method in 2 hours. So this is a big caveat. This is basically just a taster, which then hopefully will inspire you to go on and do more. And I've got a little presentation with some bits at the end about other forms of support and where you might go to for training. There is an empirical research network within the faculty, and so we have amazing opportunities for mentorship and support and training if you choose to go down this path. What I will say though, after that very kind introduction, is that your PhD is actually an excellent time to be experimenting with these sorts of methods. It's kind of, if you're planning an academic career in particular, it's the one time you really have to have the time and space to do the training, to practice, to make mistakes, and to have really excellent guidance as you make that kind of trial and error process. So you get really quality feedback and support. Whereas if you graduate into, say, an academic position, you won't necessarily have the same level of mentorship. The other point would be, these are really important transferable skills. So if you're looking to undertake a career in the public sector, government, agency work, or even go into the private sector, the ability to do rigorous empirical evaluations is really valued. So these are important skills from a transferability perspective as well. So what I thought I would do today is kind of give you a bit of an overview, a bit of a taster, a bit of inspiration maybe to then take it further and do more. And I'm always happy to chat with anyone who is experimenting here or who needs guidance. I do a lot of wayfinding with people, so you're always more than welcome to contact me for that purpose. What I thought that I would do first to make sure that I'm pitching this correctly is anyone currently doing empirical research in their thesis? 0. Okay. Oh, sort of one. Okay, Rowan. Oh, 2.
I'll just say very briefly that I don't think I was calling it empirical research, because I also came from a critical law school as opposed to a black letter law school. So our critical lens was also about asking what is the effect, what is the thinking behind the law. So when I read the article, I was just like, oh, I haven't been calling it empirical research, but some of that thinking has been there in my doctrinal work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and there's kind of a very blurry line there between socio-legal research, which looks at kind of the impact of law, and empirical research, which tries to kind of measure or quantify that through non-secondary sources. So the line there is really, I'll talk a little bit about this. It's a very weird line. It's hard to talk.
Alicia, before you do that, because I actually think that's really also conceptually very interesting, I just want to add that one of our other, Rowanna might want to explain what she's up to as well, but we're recording this session because of some people being in time zones that it's not appropriate. But one of those is Bernadette Egan, who was up at 5 o'clock in the morning in our last one. But she's doing work on architects' training and education in architecture around accessibility, and looking particularly at sort of very nuts and bolts things to do with the education and training and continuing training of architects. So I would imagine there's definitely some empirical research going on there that's empirical as well.
Absolutely. So Rowanna, do you want to just mention briefly what you're thinking or planning?
Yeah, my original proposal had a case study component for a couple of country studies potentially. The exact methodology, I'm still working through, and as I'm reading, I'm kind of taking notes of different methods of empirical research so that when I come to design it, I've got some ideas. But yeah, I think I'll need to do some empirical research for my project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's amazing about empirical research is that it can inform so many different questions. So, and we have this amazing array of methods. Some people talk about legal researchers as kind of magpies. We pick and choose our method, which some people see as inherently risky. I see it as a world of opportunity. So long as we're rigorous in what we do and we have a good theoretical grounding and a rationale for why we've chosen that method, I think we have great possibility to use these methods in really interesting ways. The other really interesting thing is that empirical legal research is not so common. It's more common in some fields than others. That can mean it's quite hard to get guidance, and it can mean that it's quite hard to find empirical studies, but they are out there. But as Sanam has said, they're not always called empirical. So we don't always label it, and we don't always kind of really own what we're doing. So I was looking at a book review of someone's PhD the other day, and they said it would have been nice if they'd said how many interviews they conducted. And you think, oh, that's a pretty fundamental, yeah, if you're going to do interviews, say how many you've done. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what makes good empirical research. And that will obviously vary according to the method and your purpose and your question that you're trying to answer. So everything is contextual. I'll just kind of give you the headline things, which will hopefully give you enough information to go away and do more and have a deeper look into many of these issues. Any questions before I kind of kick off and get stuck into some substance?
Or is there anyone else whose project they can have a sense might have one of these dimensions that they may not have realised yet? I think maybe as Alicia explains more, there might be some resonance that you'll go, oh, hang on, maybe. So if at any point you want to come in with that, please do. Because the more that Alicia understands about the basic structure of your projects as well, the more she can illustrate some of her points of principle. So don't be shy.
So I'm structuring this largely as kind of a persuasive exercise to encourage you to think about how you might use this and that it might be worth the effort. I know in the PhD program in some years, academics have said, oh, don't do empirical work, it's too much effort. So part of why I'm here today is to say to you, this is why it's worth the effort. This is why we will do this. Okay. All right, so I have a very, well, short or long presentation depending on how we go. Interrupt me all the way through. Happy to take questions as we go. It's definitely the easiest way to do it. I have some kind of illustrative things to help you understand what we're talking about. All right, so first I thought it would be helpful to start doing some of this delineating, kind of working out what we mean by empirical legal research and what isn't empirical legal research. And the key thing that I would say here is the line is not clear. Every scholar has their own definition and they all draw the line slightly differently. Baldwin and Davis give this definition, which is quite nice because it's quite clear. It seems to make sense. So, but it's both a positive and a negative definition. It's not just theoretical, it's not just doctrinal. We're not just analysing statutes and cases. We're not just looking at secondary sources. We are studying the operations and the effects of law by going beyond the books. And so they've defined the books quite broadly here. It's beyond secondary sources and materials. So one way to think of this is we're actually going and engaging with the world. We're engaging with people through something called direct methods. So the idea is that we directly source information to inform our research and inform our answering of our research question. So the question then is, how is this different to doctrinal research? Obviously, it's moving beyond cases and statutes. So that, in a sense, is different. But some scholars, such as Van Hoek, see legal doctrinal research as actually partly empirical in its nature. They argue that you cannot systematize law and create meaning to law without looking beyond law as it's written on the books. So for some scholars, the line between doctrinal and empirical research is incredibly blurry. It's difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. So the first thing that I would say is this line drawing exercise, maybe not so important as we try to frame a project. If you're doing something that goes beyond traditional kind of cases, legislation and their analysis, you're starting to edge into the doctrinal world. I think where it gets quite murky is particularly studies that use like content analysis or other forms of analysing secondary documents. They're not traditional legal research, but they're not necessarily going beyond secondary materials. So they're the sorts of projects where it starts to become a little bit blurry. Doesn't mean we don't do it, just means we don't meet Baldwin and Davis's interpretation of what's empirical. That said, I've done a lot of really interesting projects where I've used cases in weird and wonderful ways beyond just traditional doctrinal research. And those papers are actually really interesting. What about counting cases? What about counting the lack of cases? That isn't traditionally how we would analyse cases, but it's still an interesting empirical dimension to the use of case law. So I would argue that using cases in that creative way verges more towards the empirical, or at least beyond traditional doctrinal research. So in terms of why we would do this, why would we go beyond case law and legislation, given it's a tried and tested method to analyse our cases, it's an easy way to do our thesis. The advantages of undertaking empirical legal research are significant and they're dramatic. And I'll go into this a bit more later. But really, if we're interested in knowing more than just what the law is, if we want to know what the law should be, or if we want to know the impact of the law in practice, drawing on empirical data and empirical investigations gives us a far more meaningful answer to those questions. If we know how the law works, whether it has an impact on individuals and organisations and governments, we are in a much better position to say that there needs to be legal change, or that we need to change our existing legal framework, or that there's a need for legal intervention because there are gaps. If we don't go beyond cases and legislation, we don't really know what law does. We might know what the law is, but we don't know what law is in the real world. So there's really important reasons why we might do this sort of work, particularly if we're interested in these questions of legal impact, legal change, and if we want to mount kind of both an empirically grounded and normatively grounded case for legal reform. So empirical scholarship complements doctrinal work and it complements our normative analysis. They all go really nicely hand in hand and they can inform and be mutually reinforcing. And that's where the really best empirical legal projects sit. is at that intersection of doctrinal, normative, and empirical work, in my perspective. So this is what we are thinking of empirical legal research, kind of generally what it would be, noting, of course, that the lines are not always clear. But it's not always appropriate. Ultimately, as I'm sure your previous sessions have always said, it all comes back to your research question. Some research questions lend themselves to empirical legal research. Some research questions are much more simpatico with legal doctrinal research. And in any study, the importance is discerning between the two. What questions are best answered by going beyond law in the books? What answers lie in the books themselves? So we need to be really careful as we think about our research question and identify what is our strategic method in pursuing an answer to our research questions. So, and perhaps we can come back to this question in a bit. Something that I've been doing with some of my classes in the JD, and with the help of the good old people of Twitter, is putting together this map of existing empirical legal research. Now this is it is small, I do apologise, and it's available on the internet freely to download. So you can download and use it for future reference if need be. But essentially we've been mapping the sorts of questions and projects that have used empirical methods to see kind of as inspiration, but also giving a map of topics that have already been explored or that could be explored in the future. So with this kind of collaborative effort, we've kind of found that there are 4 key areas where we're using empirical legal research, or maybe even 5, thanks to someone on Twitter. So the first question is about how law evolves or occurs. So where is law coming from? What are the drivers of change? How is law justified? What is the discourse used? And these sorts of projects veer into the secondary sources. They might look at kind of public materials, news reports, secondary reading speeches. They might look at the justification in government statements and speeches, but they're often using methods that are not traditional doctrinal methods, like content analysis or discourse analysis. So they're often using secondary materials, but they're using more creative methods to look at how law evolves, essentially. A related question would be about what law is. And this is kind of a normative or theoretical question about what actually do we see as law? So what fulfills the requirements of law, and how do we ascertain other things that might actually come to count as law or norms? An area where lots of scholars are working relates to how law is enforced. And that might be through studies of lawyers and the legal profession, the study of the profession itself in terms of stress, diversity, working conditions, but also in terms of how they use empirical data themselves in their advocacy. It might look at legal education, broader legal services beyond the strict legal profession, but also obviously the work of police, regulators, and then judges and judging. So how disputes evolve, the use of alternative dispute resolution, the evolution of claims and cases, and the judicial profession itself. So looking at, again, conditions of stress or diversity, looking at how juries behave, and how judges use empirical legal research in their decision making. So, oh, and the other point that someone also made is that we could also look at how norms and conventions are used to enforce law. So this has occurred particularly in public law scholarship, looking at alternative forms of enforcement beyond kind of strict action by regulators or police. So this enforcement aspect is kind of the biggest pocket of research that's been undertaken to date. There's a lot of scholarship, particularly looking at alternative dispute resolution, what's operating in the shadow of the law, but also a really interesting pocket of scholarship looking at the work of judges and surveying judges and practitioners. So actually looking at how these things work in practice, and also legal education, knowing what works in terms of educating the next generation of lawyers. A third substantive pocket relates to assessing legal impact. So how do we know whether law is effective? And this is where we can tie this really closely to that normative discussion. We need criteria to know what it is we mean by effective, and then we assess that using empirical methods. But we can also think about the many and varied organisations that law might have an impact upon. So it might be the impact on organisations, on the general public, on broader social or economic outcomes, including health, well-being, inequality. We can look at all of these things and how law might impact upon them over time. But we can also look at the impact of law on evolving norms and standards amongst particular groups of people or in society more generally. And then we can trace legal impact over time by looking at the effect of legal change. So when a law is introduced, what changes over time on various groups and on these social indicators. And then the final pocket of research relates to identifying legal gaps. Where is there no law? And then that we can use to then create a case for legal change. All of these topics could be used to create a case for legal change. And in fact, that's one of the real contributions of empirical research, is that it gives you a really grounded, informed argument for whether law is working or not working, depending on your normative standard for assessing that.
Alicia,
yeah.
Can I ask something?
Of course.
This is so you did this map with your students, you say? Is this?
So I started this with my students. So I started it before class. The students have added and embellished, and then I threw it out to the internet at large to help refine it and finish it off.
Because it's absolutely, I mean, it's its own kind of empirical study of the nature of empirical legal study, in the sense that, well, I think what's really fascinating here is how you are identifying that the bias of empirical legal research at the moment is heavily on the enforcement side.
Yep.
Not on, and yet we can understand a lot of the other areas as, I mean, enforcement, of course, comes into contact with things like impact and efficacy and so forth, or conditions for efficacy. And they're all mixed, but it is really interesting that a legal scholar's default starting point in the majority of cases is this assumption that there's a thing out there, it's there to be enforced, enforcement has to be in some other way materially identifiable, and that it's telling us something about the legal mind, even among those that are not doing scholarship in conventional legal ways. There are still conventions going on here that tell us something fundamental about enforcement as the like end point of legality. Yeah. So that's absolutely intriguing to see it mapped like this. It's very helpful.
And I think what was really interesting was, you know, it took a public lawyer to kind of come back to me and say, but what about norms? I'm like, oh yeah, what about norms?
Yeah.
Because my work is so often, you know, the project I'm doing at the moment is about individual enforcement. And it's really about, you know, how are individuals using the law and how can we move beyond that? Of course, you know, the impact on norms I kind of disregarded because my previous project said, how has everyone changed as a result of the law? And the answer was, well, it hadn't. So the impact on norms was negligible. So I've nearly kind of put that to the back of my mind and gone, well, how are we enforcing it in the black letter way? And it's too easy to forget about kind of this more subtle influence and these broader questions about what actually do we categorize as law? You know, and what do people see as law?
And because I know something like from teaching administrative law that when you study the Charter or the Victorian Human Rights Charter and you look at how hard it is to argue this in the conventional legal proceedings, and law students go away therefore thinking it's pretty hard to do and it's got to piggyback on something conventional. But then you speak to people who work in the Victorian public sector and in the day-to-day activities of the bureaucracies of Victoria, they consider themselves deeply informed by Charter requirements. But law students wouldn't normally look to that because that's just about everyday practice as opposed to the thing that involves a particular institution, a particular mode of argumentation, particular mode of claiming. And so, yeah, that's legal impact in ways that might not fit ideas of enforcement. So it's just lovely to have these teased out. Anyone else want to come in on those points? Because I could stay on this map for a long time.
Or add something in. What have I forgotten? Because this is continuously evolving. I'll put the link to this on Figshare in the chat in a second.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Which is the old version because I'm still fighting to get the new version up. But it's continuously evolving. You know, it's kind of research-informed, teaching-informed research.
Yeah. Can I ask any of the people we've got with us today, are you seeing your own projects, parts thereof, in this map? I mean, I've been noting down those of you who I can see immediately, like without trying, where empirical research may well become central. But certainly into Sanam, I was thinking of you around, you know, international violations on torture and why are they so ineffective and so forth. And that's about what's going on at the level of practice, discourse, whatever. I mean, are you seeing resonance with this particular exercise?
Yeah, it's right there, isn't it, with the legal gaps, because that's basically what I'm looking at, and sort of trying to re-articulate after the first couple of seminars on what's an effective research question to sort of go the direction that I'm thinking about. But you know, listening to both of you right now, I'm also just thinking of the work I've done with UN treaty bodies and various you know, commissions on human rights and commissions on women at the national level, because empirical research is what a lot of those sort of quasi-independent national human rights institutions do in terms of hearing from the public, surveying the public, and then making an assessment and making a recommendation. And that doesn't always, I think that's not always studied as an object the way a legal judgment is. But it does shape the world around us. I'm particularly thinking of the UN Human Rights Committee a couple of years ago. They were developing a general comment on the right to life. And they, you know, when they're in the drafting process, they receive submissions. And the Indonesian Commission on Women, they submitted their empirical research specifically on the death penalty, where they had, you know, sort of compiled all of this research over the years showing how the death penalty had disproportionate impact on women, particularly migrant women, because often they don't speak the language, they're caught up in some kind of drug case, and their assigned lawyer doesn't even know how to communicate with them to sort of say what has actually happened. And they're the ones on death row a lot of the time. The Bali Nine only makes the news because of their nationality and the powers of the countries that they come from. There's a particular case that they've been sort of advocating for called a woman called Mary Jane Velosa, who still is on life sentence. And yeah, it was very interesting. They made this whole argument based on empirical research saying that this is the impact of the death penalty, and that's why death penalty should be abolished. And that's a very different argument than a lot of organizations hadn't have been making for a long time about the abolition of the death penalty. And I think that did influence the final general comment, because I remember in the text they said that, you know, the abolition of death penalty is necessary and compatible with the progressive development of human rights. So yeah, interesting sort of spaces in empirical research at the national level through these sort of quasi-legal bodies, and then translating to international law.
But also how the last thing you said there, Sanam, about how empirical research can change the legal or political question. And that's crucial there, as in looking at it differently. Suddenly you weren't having a discussion about the sanctity of life. You were having a discussion about disproportionate impact on particular groups because of these disadvantages that are socially constructed and embedded, etc. So yeah, I'll sort of pinpoint a few more of you as we go through, because I certainly think about Claire and certainly think about Rowena and also George, a few of you, but I want Alicia to regain control here. But there's just so much going on here that is really helpful. And above all, this moving backwards. I see you're giving us, as Alicia, a bit of an invitation to consider being part of like the less travelled paths here, away from legal enforcement, and thinking about, even though it's not that you have to remove that question, it hovers. Like Rowena's project is on water governance and different kind of normative influences going on at the ground level in terms of how people are understanding rights of nature and rights to water and so forth. That could be seen as an enforcement project, but it's not. Like, it's about what's going on at the level of competing discourses and internalization of competing sets of norms for those who are at the front line of practices. Absolutely. So yeah, it's
all of these topics, right? So, you know, it's both how does law evolve, because as people's understanding of their rights evolves, you know, the legal framework kind of catches up with that slowly. But it's also looking at the impact of, you know, that conversation of rights on people. So it's, you know, it's around enforcement, it's around impact, it's around evolution. And, you know, as much as I've mapped this out, they're all interlinked because all of these questions are related, and they don't necessarily break down neatly. But I think, you know, this point about we can use this to change the conversation is actually incredibly important. And so the work that I'm doing at the moment is about who can use legal mechanisms, because we know the law is heavy, it's hard to bring a claim, it's hard to bring a complaint. You know, there are legal and substantive and procedural hurdles, but I've actually been able to map that women are more likely to experience age discrimination, they're more likely to make a complaint, they drop off before conciliation, more conciliate, fewer file with the court, fewer proceed to hearing. And you can actually see this progressive inequality getting more and more dramatic as legal proceedings go on. And it's funny, without the empirical grounding, everyone goes, oh yeah, of course it's unequal. And when you actually quantify or put kind of meat on those bones, everyone goes, oh, this is really terrible. You think, this is
and not just counting the complaints, because that's just an endpoint. Given that, you know, it could be 0.3 in that map of 8 that is the crucial moment. And if you're just counting outcomes, you're not going to actually know where the problem is.
Absolutely. And so, you know, and this comes back to some of the challenges with this sort of research, is that if you want to actually dig into what's happening before all these public artifacts, what happens before the cases, what happens before formal complaints, that's where things start to get quite tricky, because we don't keep that data. And so interviewing is a really good method for getting to the bottom of that. I've just been writing a paper about how little legal data agencies collect. They don't see it as important, they don't really care, and so they don't collect it. And that makes our work as researchers really, really difficult, because the data is incomplete, partial, unreliable, biased, and just difficult to access. So there are challenges, but let me not.
But they tell us we're just getting a little tiny part of the story, which is that which enters the realm of the formal and recorded, which has its own particular methods anyway. But the anecdotal law you're talking about, in the sense of like what's going on, that you could only, we're having this conversation with Michael before we all began, you know, how do you find out stuff if it doesn't get to those points that form part of record? And it's clearly instrumental to what's going on in the practice and the outcomes. And yet it's too anecdotal. It's literally too anecdotal for someone to study. That's the problem as it's perceived.
Absolutely. And it means that relying on public record, you will be misled. Because it's not an accurate depiction of what's actually happening. It comes back to the charter rights. You know, there's nothing on the public record, so we assume it's having no impact. And that is not true.
Yeah, great. Fabulous.
So one of the challenges with any of these projects is about choosing the right method to answer your question. So even once you have a topic, and I don't want to oversell either, as much as there's a lot of work on enforcement, there's still not a lot. So even if you're in the enforcement space, you're still, you know, there's no competition here. You can be unique and innovative no matter what you do. So I've started mapping some of the methods that you might use to do empirical legal research. And I said earlier that we can be legal magpies within the realms of what's, you know, justifiable and rational. The sorts of things that we might do to advance empirical legal scholarship, we typically break our methods down into those that are qualitative and those that are quantitative. Qualitative methods are about examining things in depth, in a contextual and nuanced way. We're really trying to get this kind of deep understanding of a few things. So the things that we might use to do that kind of qualitative, detailed analysis are things like interviews. Case studies often involve interviews, but also other things like statistics or documentary analysis. We might observe, many studies have actually observed court proceedings, so court hearings, but also observing how lawyers or organisations or governments behave. or people. So observation studies have been quite popular in the history of empirical legal research. I put here documentary analysis, but noting the discussion about whether that's purely empirical or whether that's something else. But documentary analysis will inform pretty much any other method. So you can't get away from it. And your documents here could be cases, legislation, you might use doctrinal research, you might use content analysis, which is more thematic rather than systematizing. So that's the difference between that and doctrinal research. You might use discourse analysis. So again, these methods that we take from other disciplines to analyze documents to complement your other kind of in-person things that you might do. Something that I've used with some success is called the Delphi method. And this is really interesting. It's essentially a group interview or survey, but it's about kind of trying to frame future scenarios. So you do multiple rounds and you do scenario testing with experts through those rounds to come up with the future or the idealized future. It's really interesting to do, but it's quite demanding for participants because there are multiple rounds of surveys. And typically you develop those scenarios following, say, interviews. So they've actually gone through 4 or 5 rounds of contributions to this research. So it's very demanding for participants, which makes it quite hard. Something rarely used in empirical legal research, in experimental studies. I have a colleague in a business school who has actually done this. They explored gender pay gaps, actually doing experiments with students. So often experimental studies, it's students in a lab setting being asked to pay someone depending on their skills and their gender. So experimental studies are quite interesting, but we can also do things like a pre and post test or a natural experiment looking at how legal change evolves over time. So I'm doing some work with Beth Gaze at the moment looking at the impact of the new Gender Equality Act in Victoria. So where were we at the start and where will we be in 5 years? How is this changing the public sector?
Alicia, could you just tell us, because it produced so many smiles, what was the results of the experiment about getting people to pay each other?
Basically, there is a gender pay gap and it's very prevalent amongst students as well.
Wow, isn't that interesting? The colleague that Alicia just mentioned, for those who haven't met Beth, she's also my admin law teaching colleague. She has a wonderful sign, a poster on her office door that's got 2 little kids and it says, "Prepare your daughter for the workforce, start giving her less pocket money than your son." It's just the best poster. I mean, it nails it. So yeah, there you go. That's quite disturbing, but even among students.
Yeah, and so they can also use those experimental studies to kind of look at interventions. So, you know, if we say that their company will be penalised if they don't give the woman the same pay, what happens? And some studies end up finding that even with the penalty, they still don't comply. So we can penalise someone and they still won't, you know, employ someone from a non-represented group or, you know, pay women the same as men. So experimental studies are really fascinating. They've been more common in the psychology and business literature than in the legal literature as such. And the experimental study that happened at Monash, it was largely out of the business faculty, not the legal faculty, but there was a lawyer on the project. So I'm going to count it as legal because we can. But the challenge with a lot of this is lawyers tend not to have the skills or even know that we could do it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there's often been those fascinating experimental studies about having people be jurors, like put jury scenarios to them, and choosing people who are insistent that the courts are too lenient on offenders. And consistently, the results of those experiments are the people who are the subjects of the experiment end up getting more lenient sentences than the court did. They're really, really, really instructive. Very, very helpful. So that's one of the only ones I've ever heard of, is actually that kind of experiment, which is real set up as a real hypothetical.
Yeah, yeah, and they're amazing. And, you know, I think very informative for those involved in the study too. You know, how do you raise that out to the entire population is the question. So the other thing that you can also do relates to meta-analyses. So taking lots of studies of the same thing and trying to draw out synergies. So this is kind of text-based, but it's important when there are lots of studies to try to find, you know, any threads of consistency or commonality across those various studies. Less relevant to us as lawyers because we do not have enough on any topic to actually do a meta-analysis. but in other fields, they're quite an interesting form of kind of empirically informed research. I've put some blue bubbles here with mixed methods and multiple methods. So if we use multiple methods in a project, that's using one or more qualitative methods to inform our research. So 2 or more qualitative methods is a multiple method project. Qualitative methods are inherently multiple. We always tend to use more than one. And that's where I said we always use documentary analysis plus interviews, because we don't just do them on their own. We might observe as well. So they always, you know, that deep contextual understanding is really enhanced by using more than one approach. But beyond that, we can also combine qualitative and quantitative methods. So this is a mixed method. So mixed methods are where we specifically integrate, combine or mix qualitative and quantitative findings. Not common in legal research, but very informative where it's done. If we're using mixed methods, we could use them to inform different stages of the project. We could use them to illuminate different aspects of a phenomenon. So we tie them together and we use them to kind of develop a more nuanced understanding of what's actually happening. In terms of quantitative methods can be either descriptive, so how many people did this? What was the average? What was the mean, median, mode? Or they can be explanatory, so where we identify different variables and we try to control for variables to explain a relationship between two things. One of the challenges with quantitative analysis in law is that we don't have very good data. So we could create our own data using surveys or potentially even cases, using cases or legislation as a form of data. But we could also access data from government agencies, government departments, NGOs, or potentially kind of a whole variety of different, you know, community legal centres even. The challenge though is that data, as I just said, it's often not collected, it's really scrappy, the quality is variable, it's hard to get. Government surveys tend not to ask legal questions or don't ask questions in a way that will inform our analysis of legal phenomena. So it's quite hard to use general ABS, Bureau of Statistics data, for example, to answer legal questions. And often governments choose not to report the data that they have. So not only do they not collect it, we may not know what's there. So it's very difficult to know what we can use. That said, there are lots of things we can do to try to get that data. We can file freedom of information requests, for example, to try to get access or at least find out what people have on file if they're a public entity. You could also approach an agency directly or a government department and ask them what they have and try to negotiate with them to get access to that data. I've just spent 4 years doing this, trying to get access to equality agency data across Australia and the UK. After 4 years of negotiation, I have a really scrappy data set. It's not great, it's not comparable, and I can't do any of that nice explanatory analysis because the data is too incomplete and generally just crap. So I'm doing some descriptive analysis, which is not so informative, but it's what we've got. So again, one of my key findings, you know, unexpected but key finding, is that the data that government agencies collect can be really haphazard. And actually we need to be better funding and better prioritising data collection. That maybe gives a foreshadowing of some of the challenges of this sort of research. We don't always know what we're going to find, and we don't always know what the problems will be as we go through our empirical methods. There's obviously a lot of variables as we start to go through this process. If we want to do interviews of key practitioners, for example, we can't predict that there will be a pandemic that will be run off their feet with childcare and no one will respond to our emails. We can't necessarily predict that the data doesn't exist or isn't collected, or maybe that the legislation doesn't pass and so we can't actually examine its impact. So we need to be prepared for the unexpected. It's much more chaotic doing this sort of research. It's also very rewarding, but we need to accommodate the chaos in our planning, make provision for the unexpected, and try to, as they say, you know, make a purse out of a sow's ear. So we need to try to find a way to make something good out of the unexpected. So I've been writing with my colleague about secrecy and lack of government data. So we actually have a series of publications looking at why this data isn't being collected and what it means for transparency and the openness of justice. So we've spun a really difficult situation into a really nice kind of academic contribution, where we actually look at why this is problematic for law and for legal impact. So we need to be prepared for the unexpected, even if we don't know what the unexpected will be. It might be timely to pause for a second and see if there are any questions about any of these particular methods.
I didn't have a question about the method, but specifically with workplace discrimination, I was just wondering what kind of data you might have found from trade union federations, for example, because I know that a lot of information and analysis was gathered by a lot of the international federations in the work going up to the drafting of the ILO Convention on Convention 190 on violence in the world of work.
My particular problem is that I've been researching age equality, and age is the poor relation, and no one really pays it a huge amount of attention. So all the surveys that are conducted often omit age as a variable, people aren't asked, or the sampling of older and younger workers is so small that the results become unreliable. So I've approached a number of trade unions and said, what have you got? What have you been doing? And they've just said to me, oh, we haven't really thought about it. So that's what my particular problem. But certainly in other areas, there is a lot of information. And there's a lot at the moment about violence, sexual harassment. There are some really excellent surveys that have already been conducted. So there's a lot, just not on my particular niche.
Alicia, also, the disturbing, but no doubt correct research finding about absence of government data on lots of things. That is something worldwide that is an outgrowth of neoliberal styles of government, which are not particularly interested in policy making, and policy making is, of course, data dependent. So you actually have a problem. When you mentioned FOI, FOI, you can't bring anything into existence for freedom of information. You can only find what's there. So the less that's there to be found, the less that can be given. And so it does show that responsibility for data collection in any number of policy areas, it could be literally anything in our lives, does fall to universities in ways that, you thought you could rely, or I would think I could rely on something that government agencies would keep, but actually there's all sorts of motivations, sadly, for being under dated at the governmental level. And so it just goes to show the urgency of empirical research coming from other quarters, insofar that if you're interested in policy development, you push it from a informal political space by doing your own work, because it's not necessarily happening. I don't want to be too apocalyptic about it, but it's not necessarily happening in the engines of what you would normally consider to be policy formation.
Absolutely. And the best way to avoid a problem is to not measure it. Exactly. If we know about it, we can't possibly say it's a problem. So that's certainly the case. It's interesting too, though. I think I have a very good kind of sympathy or comprehension now of how difficult it is to collect this sort of data.
Yeah.
And so one of the UK bodies has put in a new data collection process, and they've brought in experts and they've paid a huge amount of money to get that expert assistance to create, I think it's essentially Power BI, which is what we use for our research money assessment. So it's nothing that crazy, but it's taken them 18 months and they're still getting junk out of the system. And part of it is you need someone inputting the data to know what they're doing and to take it seriously. And for these equality agencies, that's 300 conciliators who have really heavy workloads and they're working from home in a pandemic. They're not going to be paying a lot of attention to putting in data. So, and they've sent me gender data and they've said, well, we just guessed the voice of the caller to work out what their gender was. I'm like, you mean you've misgendered thousands of people because you didn't think to ask them how they would like to be, how they'd like to be recorded. So all this data, the more you look into it, the more you realize it's utterly unreliable. That's quite terrifying because it means we know so little about what's actually happening.
Any other comments or questions before we move on for a bit? So Alicia, unless you want to take, if you want to take a 5-minute break or so now,
and a moment to take a break, and then I'll start to talk about advantages and challenges.
Yeah, it's a good juncture, because let's come, I mean, if we just all want to go and get a drink or something, because when we come back at 3, we have something that Georgie and Sanam and Rowena wanted to mention anyway. So we'll just take a few minutes to do that anyway. We're having a bit of an announcement festival today. So Alicia, if you need a few more minutes, that's what we'll be doing. But why don't we just each take 5 and come back at 3 o'clock to continue with this, but after we've heard from our colleagues on their announcement, okay? So we'll just do a little pause. It'll keep recording, so there'll be a nice black screen for those who watch it later. But Alicia, yeah, because I know we're going to get overwhelmingly enthusiastic in this next hour. Something I would love your thoughts on for the group at the end, perhaps, is something that I think empirical methods would be a great way into this, is defending the legitimacy of the approaches you choose. Because we face, whichever way we go with our research, we know there's always something about what you haven't done and which perspective you haven't taken. And what I'm really finding so valuable about what you're saying is, among the things I'm finding so valuable, is the fact that if you need to cobble together a patchwork of modes to illumination, and that, you know, in a world that's otherwise a vacuum, like, do it. You know, they can complain about you later when they've done something better.
Yep, exactly.
So this sort of thing, I just think it's actually very important at this stage of people's projects, and always anyway, because we feel so, you know, how do we do things properly? You know, how do we do things? And inquiry is an unusual game. And so if you could just bring that in at the end, that'd be lovely.
Sure. Also, it's iterative, it's imperfect, and it's messy. And empirical research shows that really clearly, but actually it applies to all forms of research.
Of course it does.
You know,
and it's just more stark with this.
That's it. It takes away the illusion of perfection, which we so often seek in legal research, but we can't possibly achieve. So, you know, exactly. We're confined by various practical things, no matter what path we take. And if I might give my skeptic's view, if you adopt empirical methods, examiners tend not to be as well schooled in those methods.
They dare not doubt you.
My other things. So it's nearly a get out of jail free card, depending on your
but there's always reasons, you know. Why did you interview people once? It's because it was the only fair way to do so. If I was to interview them with the same 5 questions and this was the conditions, I mean, there's reasons, as long as these reasons have been well thought out and so forth. Now we're all trickling back in. Roanna, it was you, Georgie, and Sanam wanted to just say something about the legal theory thing, yeah? Can I just, before we do that, if you three want to stay behind for a minute or two at the end, I'll have a chat with you about the question you're asking about the topics and stuff like that. But in terms of announcement, do we have enough people back? I think we do. So if you want to take over for a second, whoever is leading that.
Sure. Actually, now looking at everybody who's present, this is only going to be new information for a couple of people, because some of you I tried to recruit, and some of you saw my message in our cohort WhatsApp group, which if you're not in it, I think you can let Michael or one of us know. Basically, Roanna, Georgie, and myself, we've decided to help organize the Doctoral Forum on Legal Theory, which is a student initiative that's been running for more than a decade now. And that's been a space for us up-and-comers to sort of share what we're doing and give feedback to each other, as well as exchange with other universities as well. And until last year, it was an actual in-person forum. People came in from different parts of Australia and sometimes other countries as well. But last year, the previous team, they just did it as an online forum. So we're going ahead with also holding it as an online forum. I'll share the link from last year's one here. So we're going to be following a similar timeline, and we hope to have a call for papers out at the end of by the end of June, with the early September or 1st of September as a deadline for submissions. And we'll also have after that some space for people to just apply to attend as just observer participants. You don't have to write a paper to attend. basically, we're hoping that this can be a space for us to just exchange. And since it's not happening in person, maybe we can spread it out a little bit more with other universities, because we don't have to worry about getting funding to get people to attend. We just have to be mindful of time zones and things like that. I think our request here is, just to let you know it's happening. Hope that you're interested. If you want to join our little organizing committee, you're most welcome. But the main thing is we'd love to have input from our cohort on what the theme could be for this one. We did a review of the themes from the last decade. I can put that in the chat, or this can also be in a follow-up email. And we're going to do our own little brainstorming and sort of think through what we want to make the theme, but we didn't want it to keep it to ourselves. We thought we could get forage for ideas here, especially since I think we noted that some of the themes seem to be all about containment. You'll see that there's borders twice, there's contamination, and there's lockdown from last year. So one idea might be about spaces that law is opening up. I'm sure we're getting ideas now from Alicia with as well. So yeah, just keeping it open. Roanna and Jordan, do you want to add anything?
I was actually just going to say, if anyone wants to stay behind for 5 minutes or something at the end of the session, because that's what I'm happy to have a chat with you about that. If anyone else wants to chime into that, you're welcome to. So we can just spend 10 minutes at 4 o'clock to get that going, and then you guys can follow up. Roanna, how's your whippersnipper problem going there?
It's very loud, but I'll speak briefly. Yeah, I was just going to add to that. If anyone wants to just send any of us a message, afterwards, once they've had time to think about it as well, then yeah, go for it too. That's fine. I think we've sort of got a week or so to work it out.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll resume a short discussion about that at 4 o'clock, and Caitlin's going to have Caitlin, do you want to mention your point now, just while we're finishing up on that instead?
Oh, sure. Just a couple of us are thinking that every other Thursday when we don't have RSP, if anyone wants to do a social Zoom catch up, given that we're not all in the same place, we could kind of have an open, anyone who's around could send a Zoom link and join in. I'm not sure that we just wanted to let anyone know in case they weren't in the email list or the WhatsApp group. You could send me an email. And then,
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a wonderful idea. And I know that some of the upper year PhD students last year used to do things like put Zoom on all day and just work with each other, take breaks at the same time. But they would just have Zoom on in their respective houses, and they'd just be getting on with what they were doing. But they could see other people doing it, and they actually found that very reassuring. But being able to meet once a week and bring a cup of tea at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock and just have that as a drop-in, I think it's a really lovely idea. So I encourage you all to do that. That's cool. So Caitlin, you've got the details that people need around that and so forth. Cool.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed that you are refusing to be contained by the containments of 2021. I'm very impressed. Thanks guys for all of those announcements. And Alicia, back to you. Okay.
As I frantically try to navigate the technology, having just said we won't be contained by 2021. All right, so I'll start the screen share again. I want to talk a little bit about how we use these methods in practice, the advantages, the limitations, and a note that I haven't put on the slides, but which I want to talk about is the pandemic, because that has really changed this whole idea that we go out and we meet with people. That has not become as easy as it might have been in the past times.
And Alicia, you will be hopefully allowing us access to those slides. Thank you, because they're marvelous.
I put a link to the original diagram in the chat, and I will try to get the new one uploaded. I'm having technology fights at the moment with PNG and other formats, but I will also send around the new link when that's up.
Thank you. It's invaluable. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk briefly about why you would do this sort of work. And the first point, obviously, and the most obvious point would be if it's the way that you need to answer your research question, and if there's no other way to answer it, then this is really going to focus your attention on empirical legal research. But in terms of the practical benefits, in terms of why you might choose to take this path if you had a choice, well, the first point is something we've already flagged, which is about guaranteed originality. So as a PhD student, our worst fear is that someone will go out and publish a book on our topic before we get our PhD submitted. This is a legitimate fear. It very rarely happens, though, I've got to say. It doesn't happen often, even if it's theoretical. So don't worry too much. But also, if you've done empirical research, it is by its nature original and innovative. No one will have done the exact same empirical fieldwork. No one will have drawn on the same data. No one will have conducted the same interviews. It is impossible to step on someone else's toes and for them to take your thunder. So this quote here is taken from a report which was done for the Nuffield Foundation in the UK. It's 10 years old, but apparently things have gotten even worse since they wrote this report. So this report said, while a wide range of themes and issues have been addressed in empirical research, the number of researchers working on any area is very small, coverage of issues is thin and patchy, entire areas are untouched. There are fields calling out for empirical research. This is important for reasons of policy, for reform, for deeper understanding of the law and legal processes in action. The field is wide open and the scarcity of research guarantees originality. So if this isn't an incentive to include an empirical component in your thesis, I don't know what is. One of the criteria for a PhD thesis is that it is original. So empirical research is by its nature original. There you go, there's myself. The other interesting thing, and you'll see on the next slide that this is there is a flip side. In some journals, with the right framing and the right presentation, I personally think empirical scholarship can be easier to get published. But there's a lot of caveats to that statement. I've had a lot of rejections from the big law journals. Things like the Modern Law Review, they really don't want to know. But if you choose the right journal, and potentially very prestigious journal, this research gets in, and I've had articles accepted with no revision. Just great big tick, thank you, we'll publish it next month. So the journals that I've had real success with are UNSW Law Journal, obviously, but also Melbourne University Law Review loves this sort of work. And in the UK, Legal Studies, they think this is fantastic. A very prestigious journal, Generalist Journal. And in my particular field of labour law, the Industrial Law Journal thinks this is fantastic. There's also the Journal of Law and Society in the UK, but they tend to be more theoretical. They like more of the theoretical socio-legal work. And empirical work is less to their liking. So what I have found is it takes a bit of trial and error in your field to find the right home for this sort of scholarship. There are journals in the US that are specifically for empirical legal research, but their definition of empirical is highly quantitative. They want numbers, they want statistics, and if you have qualitative research, they tend to be less sympathetic. But in the UK and Australia, qualitative research is seen as really important and interesting and innovative. So I've had a lot of success once I've found the right journals in getting this work through with very few revisions. But it's all about how you frame it. So getting the right support and mentoring to put your empirical data in the right lens and with the right framing to make it acceptable to those journals. That's partly trial and error, partly about getting people to read your work before you submit, who have some familiarity with those journals. The other thing about this is it's really incredibly interesting. And even if we're doing our empirical work, say interviews via Zoom, it's still a real bright point in what can otherwise be a really difficult research process, to be able to engage with people in a scholarly way. So some of the most rewarding conversations that I've had with people have been through expert interviews done as part of my research. And in the context of working from home, being remote, not seeing colleagues so much, it's actually a really nice scholarly excuse to have these really important conversations with people. So it is deeply interesting, particularly if you're a people person and you love getting out there. But even for us introverts, it's incredibly rewarding and you get to see how law is operating in practice. So it's one of the more interesting and both intrinsically rewarding parts of doing legal research to me. In terms of how I came to it, I'm a terrible doctrinal scholar. I do not find doctrinal research deeply fascinating. I am very capable at it, but it just doesn't float my boat. I'm more concerned with people. So for me, it adds the people element back into my research. It lets me actually think about what matters and what has impact. whereas I don't get the same enlivening influence from my doctrinal research. It's very important, I'm very capable, I can do it, but where I'm enlivened is when I'm actually doing this sort of empirical scholarship. So that's kind of the sell. It's super fun, it's interesting, it will get published, and your PhD will be innovative. But I've got to give you the but. Okay. All right, here are the problems. And all of these will manifest in different ways depending on your project, depending on the methods you choose. The first one is about funding and cost. This is actually less of a problem now because it's far more acceptable to do, say, interviews via Zoom, because we have to, we can't travel. So actually, I think funding and cost has become less of a problem than it used to be. When I was doing my PhD, I had to physically travel to locations to do interviews in a way that, you know, it's more meaningful if it's done in person. It's more kind of, you can extract more from people if you're physically present. But it meant that I was traveling to Finland in -16 degrees and spending $600 a night on a really basic kind of awful hotel room. These projects were incredibly expensive. And without really excellent fieldwork funding or a really big grant, it's nearly prohibitive to do this sort of work. Now, of course, we just send everyone a Zoom link and off you go. So it's actually a really good moment in time to be doing this work if you are funding constrained. The problem, of course, is we do tend to get more from people when we're physically present. We know Zoom is a pretty good approximation, but it's not perfect. If you're doing interviews during a pandemic, just acknowledge that in your methods. Just acknowledge that it might have been better to do it in person, but you just can't, because we're going to have to be really pragmatic, I think, going forward about how we do research, because it's just not possible to do it the way we used to. So I think the key thing about all of these is just acknowledging the limitations of your scholarship. Nothing is perfect. So long as we're open and transparent about what worked and what didn't work and what we would have done differently, then I think it's fine. And we can get away with all those justificatory kind of rationales. Empirical research takes time. It potentially takes a lot more time than doing doctrinal research. So over the last few years, I've been systematically coding 108 expert interviews. The coding of each interview at its worst can take about a day. So if we think about that in terms of time, we're talking like nearly half a year to code these.
Alicia, what is coding?
Oh, excellent question. Okay, so when we conduct an interview, for example, it depends on the method that you choose. So I will conduct an interview using semi-structured questions, which means there's kind of broad, open-ended questions that allow respondents to talk. From the literature and the interviews, I will choose themes, and then I will use coding, so basically drawing out those themes or highlighting those themes in the interview transcripts. So coding is really just identifying themes in the interview results, basically. And then you order it by theme and you analyze it and say what the theme said.
I see. So you could say, you know, on the question of employment opportunity, X number of respondents saw this as confined by age. And then that sort of theme is opportunity, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So it enables you to get through and analyze, it organizes the data for analysis.
Yeah. So if you think about this, the old school way that we would do this before technology overtook us is we would transcribe our interview, and then every time a new idea emerged, we would cut the transcript with scissors and then, or highlight it, and then organize it into piles. And so you'd have a pile. So my research, it was, you know, fear of retribution for making a complaint. So I would have my pile of little cutout bits from all these different interviews, and then I'd stick them together on a piece of paper. I do not joke. I do not joke. Stick them on a piece of paper, and I would have my piece of paper, which was fear of victimization, for example.
I think that sounds wonderful.
Fun, but you've got to highlight the themes, highlight the respondent, make sure you know who said what, stick them in the right spot, don't lose your piece of paper, hope the cat doesn't eat it.
Yeah. And a lot of time spent at a stationery shop buying coloured folders.
Yeah, lots of tabs, lots of colour folders. Okay, the way we do this now, there's software called In Vivo, and you just highlight and code it to what they call a node, and it's done. And then you click on victimization and they do everything and it's all done, and then it creates a word cloud and you're laughing. So it's much easier.
Just for the group's benefit, you might remember that Christina Ward, the librarian, is very happy to offer in vivo training to all of you if it's helpful.
Yep. So if you're interested in vivo, Christina's fabulous. Christina's fabulous on many things, but she's very all over in vivo. We've also been doing some training on this as part of the Empirical Research Network. So once you're ready, there's also a user group at the university level. They do a lot of training and kind of extended advanced training for everyone around the university. So there's lots of support if you choose to go that way.
And so PhD students finding their way with these techniques, even contemplating using them at all, would be welcome to be part of that network and its discussions and events.
Yeah, of course.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
Details on a later slide.
Good.
So yes, so in terms of what coding is, as you start to read about methods, you'll also read about the ways you analyze this sort of data. And so coding is part of content analysis, which is one of the methods that you might use to analyze this sort of interview data. There's lots of different things you can do. That's just the way that I approach it. It's kind of a thematic analysis of the information. But it does take time. This stuff is slow. It's quite laborious to do this work. And as I mentioned, it took me 4 years to negotiate access to data with the quality agencies because they are slow. FRI requests take 6 weeks, 2 months to come back. So these things are not immediate and you need to factor that time into your planning. And things will be delayed. You know, it takes 2 weeks to organize an interview or 2 months, depending on your respondent. The other thing is all of this requires ethics approval. So in terms of adding an extra layer of time and demand, all of this must go through the ethics committee. And I've got some details on a later slide about how we do that. There's a new process at the university. I haven't personally gone through the new process, but it's meant to be much quicker and easier. I don't yet have data on whether that's the case, but it's meant to be getting easier to do ethics. What ethics does require though is for you to put in all of your materials for every method that you're going to use. So you need your list of interview questions and you need your survey and you need all of the assessment of risk that you're going to put in. So you have to plan every step of your project before you can apply for ethics approval. Then wait a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks for that approval to come through. Possibly revise your application if there are any issues. It goes back, you have to go through that process again. I've had 4 or 5 back and forths with the ethics committee about the right consent wording, phrasing, making sure the capitalization is correct on my consent form. So it requires some time. You know, it's not rocket science, but it does take time to navigate. The other point here is we need training to do this and to do this well. Fortunately, Melbourne is pretty good in its training. And we're working at the faculty level to actually bring in more training as well. And so one of the things that I'd like to ask you before we finish is what training would actually help you so that we can target that more strategically. And the related point is about ensuring rigor and quality, but also getting really good feedback from our colleagues. If we write a doctrinal essay, it's quite easy to know who we might send that off to. You know, we can look up various members of the faculty and send that out. But actually finding the right person who can give you feedback on your method can be complicated. And that's, again, where we're trying to make things better within the faculty to give a really structured approach to how you can get that critical feedback. The other thing that has been suggested by my colleagues and I early on is that actually some journals do not like this sort of work. And this is certainly true. My odds of being published in the Modern Law Review are not high. But I'm okay with that. You know, I've resigned myself to this. And actually there are far more interesting journals that I can target this work at. So I think if you're trying to meet traditional law metrics, it can be quite hard as an empirical scholar because you are not traditional and you are not meeting those original kind of standards, particularly around theory. But the work is still compelling, important, and can actually achieve really important change. So a number of my empirical projects have prompted really amazing law reform because people can look at it and go, oh, okay. So for example, judges do not wait until retirement age to resign. They resign at the age at which they draw their pension. So therefore, if we're worried about retirement ages, we shouldn't be, but we should be really carefully looking at judicial pensions. As a result of this, the Northern Territory has increased their judicial retirement age, so that particularly those who have come back to a judicial career later in life, especially women, have more chance to actually do that career properly, rather than being forced to retire at age 60, 62, 65. So there are challenges, and our things won't always go the way we want them to. We just need to acknowledge that as we go through and do this sort of work. So I have a table here, which I've done with some of my JD students in terms of trying to evaluate what is good and what is weak empirical legal research. So how might we know that work is good, and when might there be problems? I'd be interested to hear from you all in terms of what would you like to see in good empirical scholarship? What would make it good to you?
Clarity around what was asked and the sort of the transparency about the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably the number one thing, is being clear about what you did, what you didn't do.
Some understanding of sample size, for example, like how the scope of the study that was taken.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing about sample size is if we're doing something that's quantitative, just using numbers, we want the biggest sample we can possibly get. Yeah. So thousands or tens of thousands would be great. But if we're doing qualitative research, I've seen studies with 4 interviews. And that's because your aim is completely different. You want a deep understanding, not sheer numbers. So
justification for the sample, whether it could be you want to only interview retired chief justices of the states and territories, and of that there's maybe 6 that are living or something like that, right? And so that's why.
Yeah, absolutely. So justification, and as Caitlin says, transparency around why you made the decisions you made. I think that's probably the number one thing. Recognizing that we make decisions at every point and just explaining why you went the way you went.
Yeah.
Anything else that would help to make our research good? We might need to go back to the literature to create a normative framework for, so we always need to go back and consider our research question. We need to think about why our method matches our question.
Yeah, the fit.
Yeah, so the fit between method and question is, transparency is number 1, fit is number 2, because transparency helps to explain the fit. The other thing I would say would be grounding it in legal and non-legal literature around the method. So really engaging with the methodological scholarship to help explain your choices. And a lot of this isn't in the legal field. You will need to go back to the social science literature, for example, to actually work out how to do the method and how to do it properly.
Could I ask you, Alicia, because that's a very important point here in terms of the relative lack of empirical legal research compared to other disciplines, even though there's so many ways it's evidently relevant. Are scholars at whatever level, my level, your level, or the level of our group today, are they intimidated by that what feels like an interdisciplinary leap to be able to be appropriately equipped with the methods? Because in the same way that we're all shy to be truly interdisciplinary, in the sense that you have to be in a practice in order to really understand it, then we can look at methods as a kind of other disciplinary world, not just a toolkit, but a world in which there is scholarship about the toolkit, and that's got its own vocabulary, its own presumptions and so forth, especially around social sciences or economics and so forth. So that stuff scares me, I'll own that. and as to whether or not, you said, can't I just do an interview? Why do I need to know these things? But I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of how you jumped that hurdle? Was it as much of a hurdle as you thought?
So I have to come clean. I did a politics degree in my undergrad as well as a law degree. And I specifically, even then, with foresight into the future, I chose units on methods. So I studied qualitative and quantitative methods at undergraduate level. Those units were far too superficial to do anything, frankly. We were talking about how to average numbers, which, that doesn't take you very far in terms of real world research. I've done further training. I did a lot of training in my PhD. I made use of all the courses that I could possibly get my hands on. The stats courses were terrifying.
Yeah.
100% beyond my depth.
Yeah.
And I spent 3 months reading a stats textbook, and that was not a pleasant 3 months. It was tough. And the irony was, in the end, the data that I had to do statistical analysis on was so limited that I couldn't use half of what I'd learned about statistics anyway. So it was actually deeply not useful to do all of that work. But certainly in terms of my professional development, it was useful.
One of those character building experiences. But how viable is it, therefore, to bring in, with your projects, to bring in practitioners of those methods when it's your weakness? I would be, if it was 100% out of your depth, it would be 1,000,000% out of mine, right? So how can you bring, how much do you have to be the one-stop shop as the researcher, as opposed to outsourcing very specific aspects of what you are interested in to practitioners of these crafts?
Absolutely. So once you're post-PhD, collaborative opportunities, working with people in other disciplines, getting them to do the empirical work is absolutely possible. That's how most legal scholars do this work, is they work with someone else, they outsource, they hire an RA, they move it out. In your PhD, I think there's a bit more expectation that you'll do it yourself.
Yeah.
If you have no background in these sorts of methods, if you haven't done anything on this nature, the normal route in for lawyers is qualitative research, because it is more akin to doctrinal research. The work that we do in analysing cases and legislation, it lends itself quite neatly to moving to this qualitative idea. And, we kind of have a sense of how we might interview someone, you transcribe it and you draw themes out. They might use big words in the interdisciplinary literature, but at the end of the day, we're just analysing a text, which is our interview transcript, just like we would have done previously in our doctrinal research. So it's a fairly accessible entry point, and most empirical legal projects will involve interviewing in some capacity. Yeah. So that's normally how people move into this. If you're keen to do this, there is training available. And obviously interviewing is a method that's used across lots of different disciplines as well. So when we talk about, this literature, it's used in different ways across different disciplines. So I would be starting with the legal literature to see how lawyers are actually using it. The other thing you could do would be find a more senior person and go shadow them as they do an interview. Yeah. So actually, why not, just actually follow someone and see how they conduct their research. Yeah. Just ask them, or ask questions of those who have already done this. How do you manage this? How would you manage that? So this is where mentoring becomes really important.
Sure. But with the quantitative techniques, because obviously there is legal research that has its own theoretical ambitions, such as law and economics, that would be comfortable with methods that support its scholarly ambitions. Now, the sort of things that you're talking about, like we've done with Beth and so forth, are not law and economics projects. They are projects where you are doing numbers to find out what's going on, but it's to understand things like legal impact, legal enforcement, and so forth. Yeah. So there would be any number of projects, including with this group, where numbers would be extremely relevant to what they're doing. And it would come down to, well, what kind of work do they need to do with those numbers to legitimate methodologically what they've undertaken to do? So do you have any comments on that as an area of legal research?
I think that's incredibly useful and important. And I think a lot of us engage with empirical data even when we don't think of it as an empirical project.
Yeah.
So, contextualizing the problem by saying 27% of older workers think that they've been discriminated against. We're drawing on empirical data, even if we haven't actually undertaken that empirical research ourselves. As was mentioned earlier, there are a lot of surveys that have already been done by various NGOs, unions, governments on various different topics. And I think the key thing in your PhD is not trying to reinvent the wheel if you've already got a wheel in the shed. So go out, see what's already out there, use those surveys. I have never tried to survey older workers to examine the prevalence of age discrimination because the AHRC has already done that. They paid for that survey, and why not use that and rely on that? So,
and you can repurpose, I mean, there could be ways in which, now that I've got this new vocabulary around coding, there could be ways in which the original research was coded in ways that were there to emphasize particular questions that were had at that time, but that the same transcriptions can be examined for different purposes. And I know that as someone who's done a lot of archival research and what I call, the multiple visit inevitability of archival research is how you have to go back to the archive once you realise that your question has evolved and that you weren't reading for that question when you went the first time. So, or you go back to what you did take for different reasons. So I would imagine that there is, I don't know how generous agencies are. I suspect if they are like policy or think tank and other agencies, they're very keen for people to be involved in the policy discussions, but how generous they are with sharing those kinds of resources. But certainly there must be repurposing possibilities in that.
But also being aware that there are public data sets that can be incredibly useful.
Yeah.
So the World Policy Data Analysis Center out of UCLA, they've coded laws across 193 countries for various things around social rights and discrimination and health. Why not use their data that they've already produced and analyse it in weird and wonderful ways? There's also, out of the UK, there's a whole lot of research kind of archives where people upload their interview transcripts. So you can actually use those transcripts and code them in your own way. And there's things like historical studies of cohorts, interviewing them every 10 years. You can actually go back and use that research material to complement your research. So, and of course, statistical data, National Bureau of Statistics, there's a lot of information out there that you can use freely with some permission. Obviously, you need to go through various levels of vetting, but that data is already collected, so there's no need to collect it yourself.
Cool, thank you. Sanam, yeah.
I just wanted to add that sometimes if you're imaginative enough to think of how your research question results could help advance work in a policy space, you can find organizations to help fund or start the research that you're intending to do. And, I have two examples of that in my own work. I mentioned in the chat that I worked as a research assistant for somebody, and I was paid for by an institution that wanted to work with that person who was doing her PhD on a different project. But she said, okay, the interest is aligned with what my expertise is, but here's the original research that I want to do. I want to travel to 7 districts and do 110 interviews, and I need a research assistant to do that. And that's how she ended up getting funding for myself and her project to be covered in terms of accommodation, travel, and all of that. And the other example is my previous job. I worked for a regional feminist organization. We actually got tracked down by somebody who was specifically researching feminist participatory action research, because that was something we specialized in. So that researcher came and asked if she could sort of participate in the design process of one of the projects, and then she followed followed through that project for 2 years. So we had the full funding for that from our donors. She only had to cover her own travel costs. The university did not have to cover anything else for her.
Yeah, interesting. So seeing the opportunity in what someone else is doing. Yeah.
And just talking to organizations and seeing if they're interested in working together with you to answer that question.
Yeah.
That works particularly well when your kind of objectives are aligned. The only thing that I would say is just being clear about how results will be used.
Yeah.
But also who has veto? Does anyone have veto? You don't want an external organization to veto your PhD. That would be very bad. Yeah. So, you know, I think, and Melbourne is very good at helping you navigate contracts, research contracts with external organizations to facilitate projects. So if you are interested in engaging with an external organization, go through the Office for Research, and actually there are standard contracts that have all these clauses about IP and how that works to make sure you don't get left high and dry at the end of your research project. It's just risk management. All right, I will escalate and keep going to make sure we finish on time. I've got a little note here on ethics. So there is a link here to the law ethics page. It basically says any human research needs to have ethics approval. That includes interviewing, surveying, questionnaires, observation of human behavior, and audio video taping. In theory, that extends to going and sitting in court. So it's a very broad definition of what might be human research. My colleagues in other disciplines go further. They say even using ABS statistics requires ethics approval. So anything using any data that will get ethics approval. Colleagues in Sweden go even further. They have to get ethics approval just to read a case. Go figure. We're not that bad. So I'm just contextualizing to make it seem a little more reasonable than it might be otherwise. Why do we do ethics? It's really important for framing our project. It's an important tool for identifying and managing different risks. Many of our projects are very low risk, particularly those that engage with lawyers or judges. They're well-informed, educated populations that know their rights and they know the risks of engaging with this sort of research. Where it starts to get more exciting or more challenging is if you're engaging with vulnerable populations. So children, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, there are serious ethical challenges in working with these sorts of groups. So this is where ethics becomes slightly more complicated. For low risk projects, like many of ours will be, the process is generally not too demanding, except that it requires you to put together your entire project in advance. So you can't just wing it. So this is really good from a research perspective in that it forces you to do that work. Just make sure you allow enough time. And it's partly to go through the process of evaluation, to revise the project if ethics requires it, but also it just takes time to put together interview schedules and this sort of thing. So make sure you leave enough space to do that. And then I've got some links here for support and development. So I put the link here to the Empirical Research Network. There are over 60 people at Melbourne Law School doing empirical research or interested in empirical research, and you are all most welcome to join that network. We run seminars on things like in vivo software to help you with your coding. We did a session earlier this month on spatial analysis, which is super cool, which I don't do, which looks at how we use maps to kind of expand our legal research. We're hoping to get something by the Statistical Consulting Centre, which I haven't put on here, but I totally should have. They are a group at the university and they offer free statistics support to PhD students. 100% free. It's amazing.
That's amazing. That's exactly what I was talking about when I said, are there people out there that you can just, so here is the wedge that I need that enters this.
They're not going to do it for you. They will not do it for you, but they will look at what you've done and tell you that it's wrong.
Yeah, cool.
So they will. One of my friends is one of the consultants, and he's very clear when he thinks it needs improvement. So they are your critical friend who will help you reframe your tests or say that you've violated the assumptions of that statistical model or that your data is junk. I know my data is junk. I have not gone and seen him for help because I know it's terrible. But so that's the Statistical Consulting Centre. It is free support for PhD students. Again, that is something to do during your PhD, because once you are an employee, it is not free. We have to pay. So again, this is where it's really good to upskill. You get a lot of additional support as a PhD student.
Yeah, and very hard to find the time.
Yes.
And so that's the thing, is that if you don't, there's certain things that the PhD opportunity gives you, and that it's not that it's cruisy at all, but it's about doing some of the really hard stuff that is foundational, whether it be theoretically difficult, empirically difficult, that is foundational to the skills that you will use and reuse. It's very hard to find the opportunity again to build that in your skill set, whether it be empirical methods or heavy understanding of theoretical works at a deep level, for example. And so it's wonderful that these supports are out there. When you said your data is junk, right? Let's go to weak empirical research. What do you think, from an expert's point of view, is weak empirical research?
So I skipped over that because basically the flip side of what we said was good. So I think research is very weak when people are not transparent about what they've done.
Yeah.
Where they don't say how many interviews they've done, where they don't disclose the various issues that they've had, where they present their data as perfect when it's actually deeply flawed in various ways. I think the key is about transparency, but also knowing your own limits. So, we know we're not perfect, and we know when we need training to upskill on certain things. So I think the key to quality research is knowing what you don't know. I
was going to add in humility before you said like knowing your own limits, because as you said, and what we were talking about briefly in our little break, was that how you at various points in your PhD, you will have to be, and in your academic career, should you take one, you will be justifying to yourself or others why you've taken the paths you've taken. And those, as you say, there are decisions at every single point, down to what cases, what thinkers, what interviews, whatever it might be. You're making limiting decisions all the time. And so long as you have your reasons for them and you're aware that you're making them, no one's going to argue with you.
Yep.
If you do that. If it's like, for example, the pandemic intervened, therefore I changed the method and I wanted to do things this way, but then I just had to do it this way, and therefore I couldn't bring in this aspect of things that I would have done in that particular situation. That's going to be met by any reasonable audience with a lot of sympathetic nodding.
Yeah.
And I think that what's so valuable here is how you're showing us that there are such choices about how I'm going to do this in the empirical side that just brings to like sharp consciousness that factor of choice. And it's very complementary to Sandhya's session on method, that had you really thinking about, well, what is my archive? What is on my desk? What are the 3 bodies that I'm drawing from? And then what are the choices within those? And as long as you have your reasons, then and do it with integrity in relation to those reasons and with humility, you're doing really strong work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the thing is too, what I see amongst, my peers, and we're now, post PhD and we're moving through our careers.
Yeah.
Best work was done in our PhDs.
Of course, absolutely.
The PhD, it seems like it's not working and it's really messy. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? It's going to be some of your best work.
Absolutely, no question.
And you really have that headspace and that encouragement to take risks and do something really different and innovative. And that's
right. Yeah. And it may take years for you to realize just how innovative you were, or just how good the work was, because you're too busy being insecure about it. But everything Alicia just said is absolutely true. And that is why learning a skill set or doing some hard stuff, because you can stay in the headspace, or you can organize your time around, okay, I thought this was a year 1 thing and it's just become a year 3 thing for these practical reasons or whatever it might be. But it might throw you off course for a minute or two, but it's all possible. It's all still possible and justifiable in ways that it may not be. Or you'll have to be much more careful later when you're doing research, that in terms of fitting in other parameters like teaching and other things that you might need to be doing. So it's a very good point. It's a bit like, if have any musicians in the group, the sorts of music you did when you're a teenager was so well rehearsed and so well in your brain compared to anything you've ever done since. And it's the same thing. It's because you really put in the energy to do it well without realizing that that's actually becomes rarer and rarer for mere mortals from that point on. So it's a very encouraging thing to point out, given ththese people are all at, you know, year one, roughly.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate what a good job you're doing.
And you're laying the foundation for future years too.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard, but then gets easier. So the methods that I used in my PhD, I've trotted them out again to get major grant funding, and then trotted them out again to, you know, so you can use these methods over and over and over, and it gets easier every time because you don't have to do all that foundational learning about how it works. And my method section, I trot out over and over and over because it hasn't really changed, but it's rigorous because I've been finessing it over these years and kind of making it better as time goes on. I did want to ask you all though, in terms of what support you think you might need in going ahead and doing these sorts of projects. But maybe I'll finish this and then I'll stop the screen share and then ask everyone. The key points that I want to make are about starting with the research question and matching the method to the question. You can use this to add significant value, but you always need to be aware of the limits. So this comes back to this point about transparency. Acknowledge your limitations, but also don't go overboard with saying that this is going to change the world. If you've only done 4 interviews, you've only done 4 interviews. You can give a really deep, nuanced analysis of that data, but be careful when you start extrapolating because it may not hold beyond your sample of 4. So don't try to change the world all at once. Be circumspect in what you say your results show would be the key thing. And that's where there have been a few studies recently where really well-meaning studies have been tripped up because they've oversold what it was that they did or what they could say as a result. So I think transparency and just being circumspect is the key thing. The one thing I did want to raise with you all is that the law school is really prioritising empirical research because there is such a large cohort of people doing this sort of work. And we're keen to really create more structured support that really responds to people's needs. So if there is anything that you think would help you, if you're already undertaking this, or if you're thinking about it and you'd like to make a more informed decision, I'd be really open to hearing what it is you need so that we can do that. The law school is quite receptive. As much as there are budgetary limits in the pandemic, we're trying to think creatively about how we improve support within a budget-friendly way.
Can I say to that, Alicia, it's not just that that is immediately helpful for people having forays into these techniques. It's also a very important move in putting more power under this kind of scholarship. Like the sort of support networks that you are creating not only would mean that Melbourne becomes a place where you particularly come and do empirical research, but that's how fields grow, okay? That's how fields grow, is because they become hubs for them, there become more people who come to understand it, take it on themselves, and you actually, it's, if you're in this world at all, it's in your interest to be part of these things because you're actually paving the way for your future as well as dealing with issues that you're addressing in the present.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Because I don't think a lot of people in the faculty, I wasn't aware of I know of individuals, but the extent of the empirical research that's going on, and talking to some PhD students, the extent to which it's going on, is it getting the attention within the law school? I think is a reflection of the attention it gets within the academy. And that's the problem we were talking about at the beginning, which is that it is relatively unusual and yet far from rare in the immediate sense and getting stronger, and it's being encouraged. And that's a key point.
Absolutely.
It's a priority.
The other thing that we've done is create a list of those who are doing this work. Good. And the methods they use and their particular skill sets. So if you are planning to do this sort of work, if your supervisors don't have that expertise, or if you don't know about a particular method, someone in the faculty will. And
where do we find that information, Alicia? So where can we look at that?
So at the moment, it's on my desktop. So we haven't yet found a way to make that available within the law school without making it available externally. So use me as your intermediary, and I'm happy to make those connections.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. So we're not at the stage of having, it's a network, but it's not a research centre around these things. And it's, you're not wanting to put too much pressure on the people involved, but you want to make sure the right people are allocated to the right mentoring and so forth.
Absolutely.
It's very exciting. It's really, really exciting.
It is super exciting. We were hoping to have a more formalised arrangement by this point, but COVID hit and all of our progress got paused. So at the moment, it's a very informal process, but we do have the information to make it work. So if you are seriously doing this as part of your PhD, get in touch and we can certainly look at putting together mentoring relationships to make that work. I cannot make any promises to you, but as an intermediary, we can certainly make really good inroads into that. And also if there are particular training needs that you have, if you let me know, we can do something at a faculty level.
That would be, I mean, I know I would love to do interview training, for example, and I'm sure others would, even just to have that. So if it helps for me to out myself on that, so to have others who want to come along, I'd be definitely keen for that.
Yeah.
Because it's just something I've been wanting to do for a long time for a whole range of reasons. Before we've got 5 minutes left, do we have any general questions for Alicia before we wrap up? I mean, this has been so generative. The slides you will be able to, if you can get those slides to me, I can send them to the group, because I think that not just the diagram that you did with the blue diagram, but the next one that was about the different methods, I found that to be incredibly helpful in terms of bringing to and thinking about the projects of this group, thinking about how their different projects might involve, for example, aspects of discourse analysis at the same time as meta-analysis, where somebody else might be like, it was really helpful to identify what we're doing in a number of cases. So that was excellent.
Absolutely. And I think the unintended empirical work that we do as lawyers, we often go sit in court and we often go, talk to people, but we don't use this language to describe the work that we do. Yeah. That then has ethics implications because we're using it and not doing it in kind of that structured way that we would normally do it. But also it means that it's not that much of a step to then add some rigor and some method around the things we're already doing.
Yes. You said at the beginning, and it was intrigued me, the conceptual difference between socio-legal work and empirical work. And as I saw that in your handbook, I thought, okay, this is really, really interesting, because I thought of more as socio-legal work being a kind of end as opposed to empirical work being more of a method. Is that kind of getting close?
I mean, to me, empirical work is a subset of socio-legal work for the most part. So socio-legal work is all about the impact of law and the interaction between law and society. And then empirical work is one way of measuring that. So I think you're right, Kristen. It's a method versus kind of a philosophy or a theory.
Like the kind of scholarship you want to write is that's informed by those methods. So it's not just that the method is just purely instrumental, it's more than that. But when you say socio-legal, it's a term thrown around and it's hard to know when best to use it, as opposed to using the language of empirical methods, because within your suite of empirical methods was a much wider array of things than I would have thought. For example, like when I analyze public records of things or do archival research, it's a different form of empirical research.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's documental analysis, which, to me it's nearly empirical. Like it's, it just depends on the definition. For some people, doctrinal research is empirical because it's using primary documents.
That's right.
In a new and innovative way, so it's empirical. So the lines are very, I wouldn't worry too much about the lines. Where it caused a lot of consternation was in the Gann report, where they were really trying to say, look, we already have a lot of socio-legal research. Lots of people are doing theorizing. Lots of people are looking at documents. But no one's going beyond the documents.
Talking to people,
We're trying to kind of explain the gap to say, we're doing a lot of this and we're really good at that, but what about this? What about doing interviews? What about data? What about statistics?
And in any interaction, research interaction with the real world of what's going on, right? There's going to be something that mediates your relationship to the real world. It's inevitable. It will be your interview questions. It will be the sample you've chosen. I mean, there's no way you can avoid the fact that something stands between you and the real world. It's about choosing the method that you think is going to give you a particular prism through which to examine what's actually happening.
Absolutely. And that will be informed by your theoretical grounding as well, your theory of the nature of knowledge and society. So it all comes back to your theory as well. You know, if you're symbolic interactionism or whatever it is that you're going to choose, that kind of, you know, liberalism, whatever your theory of the world is, will inform your method as well. Sure. So, you know, method comes last, kind of your question, and your theory comes first.
Well, Alicia, thank you. I just think this has been invaluable. And
I did retrofit my theory to my method.
Oh, well, you do what you got to do in this world, don't you?
It can go back.
Who said things happened in order? No one. No one said that. No one said that. Thank you sincerely from all of us, and from those that are going to be watching this in recording, because that's something that we do. And it's been fantastic. So thank you again. And you're getting thank yous also from people who had to leave early that were in the chat. So if you forward those slides to me, I will happily share them with the group. And otherwise, I don't know how to actually, I can stop this without stopping the whole session. So I'm going to stop the recording now so that those of us here can have a quick chat about the other thing. But once again, this year, really, really invaluable. I've learned a lot, so I'm sure everybody else has as well. Thank you. Okay, I'll stop the recording now. Yes, I want to stop.